Hello and welcome to the Shrapnel Podcast. I'm Sam McElwain and my co-host Gareth is with me as always. How are you doing today, Gareth?
Not too bad, Sam. How are you?
I'm good. We're recording this on a Sunday morning stroke lunchtime kind of time there because the guy that we have on today is probably sick and tired of talking to the people at the minute. Probably needs 2 weeks away on an island by himself. But yes, so today is Martin Doyle. He's the books editor of the Irish Times, and he's also the author now of a newly released book, Dirty Linen, The Troubles in My Homeplace, which both me and Gareth have read through. I'm going to put on record, first of all, that a lot of this was very uncomfortable for me, in the fact that I have to face up to some home truths about things that were perpetrated in the name of loyalism. Of which, as Gareth and everybody else listening knows, that I'm fiercely defensive of, but we sort of have to own this and own the dirty linen that we have, and somehow try and sort of, not make amends, but sort of rectify this. So, Martin, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Good to meet in the virtual world.
Cheers, Gareth. Likewise, as you know, I'm a fan of your work going back a few years, whatever. So it's
Thank
great
you.
to have a boot on the other foot.
Thank you. And Sam wasn't totally honest about the reason why we're doing this at lunchtime. He doesn't actually know the real reason why we're doing this at lunchtime. It's because Forest are playing Aston Villa at 2:00. So I have to get off to watch Forest get beaten again.
We all have.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was going to bring up the sort of fact that you support an underdog, but you're not really an underdog anymore.
Manchester City.
Yeah, petro-billionaires, as you described the owners in the book.
Well, at that point, when I started supporting them, their celebrity fan was not the Gallagher brothers, it was Eddie Large. So
Yeah.
we struggle too.
Absolutely.
I'm now absolutely devastated to know that I'm basing my day around Nottingham Forest. Not to mention that Rangers are in a semi-final today, but it's Forest. Like, it's okay. This is where we're going with this. Our friendship is in danger, Gareth, I'm telling you.
It always is. It always teeters on the brink, Sam.
It does. I'm going to start off with a small quote. It's at the beginning of the book, and it sort of struck me how personal and how sort of in-depth it was. And the quote is, "The dead, far from being gone, remain as powerful as part of the community. How we think about the dead and the stories we tell about the relationship between the dead and the living are central to imagining new forms of community and narratives of nationhood." And Martin goes on to talk about they're precious and painful, and it's like walking barefoot on diamonds. And to me, that rung very true. That's what memories are. You cherish them, you love them, you hold them in your heart. But on the other hand, they can inflict some of the deepest pain that we keep reliving. Martin, that was quite powerful. But it forms the basis of what comes after in the book. Do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, so the guy you're quoting from there is actually, like, I'm quoting Benedict Anderson, who's the Anglo-Irish author of Imagined Communities. And I think, I believe that what he says is true. And that bit about, memories being as painful as walking on diamonds, like, they're painful and they're precious. So, I'm coming from a personal place in more than one way writing this book because my wife Nikki passed away 10 years ago next weekend from cancer, and obviously that's very different from the complicated grief of the people that I'm talking to in this book, who have either been horribly maimed in the conflict or lost loved ones in the conflict, people from both sides of the community. But it gives me an understanding of what loss is and how important memories are, and how your life is divided up into a before and an after by the loss of a loved one, by that bereavement, and that's something that, stays with you for the rest of your life. So, that's why it's personal to me. It's also personal to me because I've written this book about a place that I'm from. I'm a journalist with the Irish Times. I'm books editor, as I think you mentioned, but this isn't me parachuting into the parish of Tullalish. I'm from there. I grew up there. The people that I'm writing about, the people that I'm interviewing, are people that I went to school with, or the parents of people that I went to school with. And so, it's intensely personal. The other thing I'd like to say is that it's particular as well, the way that I wrote the book, because having been an arts journalist for 30 years, my background is not so much writing about murders and the conflict and so forth. It's more like, my background is more the arts, but also non-fiction, therefore interviewing historians and so forth about the conflict. And also when I was in the Irish Post for 9 years in the 90s, that coincided with the developing peace process, if you like. And also I became deputy editor and editor at that time. So I moved from interviewing writers like Owen McNamee and Roddy Doyle and so forth to interviewing some of the players in the conflict who are working to bring it to an end. People like Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, David Irvin, David Trimble, John Hume, Seamus Mallon. So, it is a kind of a coming home for me, if you like, writing this book, and the way that it's written is very personal. I like to emphasize that. I'm very conscious of, maybe not so much for listeners to this podcast, but maybe for a wider audience or a Southern audience, it might be, oh no, not another Troubles book. Do we really need one? And I kind of think what I've tried to do is something, a little bit different, or maybe significantly different, by drawing, as much on kind of, poets like Michael Longley and Seamus Heaney and Paul Muldoon. And I'm not dragging them in because Paul Muldoon's father grew flax to the other side of Portadown from my parish. Seamus Heaney, I'm sure he was surrounded by fields of flax growing up. He wrote Lintwater, which gives the epigraph to my book Dirty Linen, because he uses the stench of the lint holes where the flax was broken down in water, and it produced this horrible smell, and he used that as a metaphor for the sectarianism that tainted the North. And Michael Longley, of course, he wrote a poem about the massacre at King's Mill, but he also wrote love poetry based on the linen industry. This is like another kind of thread running through my book, because Tullalish, as well as, being a place where more than 20 people died violently during the Troubles, it's also a place that was the heartland of the linen industry, which is, to me, far more defining of the North than, say, Harlan and Wolff, the shipyards, which is specific to Belfast, whereas the linen industry was province-wide. The farmers grew the flax. Locals kind of either wove the linen from the flax, or they either in their own homes or when the industry industrialized in the big linen mills that grew up along the Bann. My own grandfather, he worked in a bleach screen just down the road from where my parents still live in Hall's Mill. And so I kind of used that as a kind of a metaphor for the descent into communal violence of the Troubles as the linen industry declined and left behind these big empty mills. Similarly, loved ones are, neighbours of mine in the parish of Tullalish, say the O'Dowds, which is where this kind of all started. Their farmhouse was abandoned, and to me, it's like a kind of a mirror image of the abandoned linen mills along the banks of the Bann.
I think it's really interesting, Martin, that you've approached it this way from a biographical perspective. And, you mentioned there about Southern audiences saying potentially, another book about the Troubles, we don't need this. But I know there was certainly a feeling like that about 10 years ago. But I think with books like yours and people coming at this history from a different angle, there is this room for fresh perspectives, and you've provided that, and you've rightly received a lot of praise for this book, and particularly from Fergal Keane, who's given it the ultimate praise. For me, it's interesting because as somebody from North Belfast, which was obviously impacted heavily by the Troubles, and Sam knows this coming from the Shankill, we do tend to be very Belfast-centric in our understanding of the conflict and the North, and almost see Belfast as a microcosm of the conflict here. But actually, Tullalish and Lawrencetown and the whole area that you write about and what happened there is a microcosm, and that's the way you approach it. I love the term that you use at the start. You talk about wanting to take a polyphonic approach. Can you talk a wee bit more about that? Because I think that's what makes this unique and sort of fresh.
I think, as books editor of the Irish Times, it's a job I came to relatively late in life. And, I like to think I approached it with a certain humility. Like, I don't think I am the great I am, or there's lots of kind of stuff about gatekeepers and all the rest of it, whatever. Like, but, to me, if I'm a gatekeeper, it's a gate that I'm more than happy to open. And I've kind of tried in my journalism as books editor of the Irish Times to make the Church of Irish Literature a very broad and welcoming one. So, in other words, I use the kind of the Irish Times website, not just the books pages, to kind of maybe give a platform to to writers who might otherwise not have featured in its pages before. And I think all to the good. So Polyphonic, for example, it's funny, like you write the book and then you start thinking about, what exactly is it? I wouldn't say I set out with this vision or whatever, but looking at it now with my kind of literary hat on, I'm kind of thinking of books like John Healy's No One Shouted Stop, which is about emigration. So it's telling the story of emigration, mostly from the South, from a very local town, from his own home village in the west of Ireland. Donal Ryan's The Spinning Heart. It's a novel, or it's a really interconnecting series of stories, and it's the story of how the Celtic Tiger died, and how basically the financial crash affected one community in Tipperary, where he's from. So, I didn't want to write just my story. I wanted to tell the stories of everyone in my parish that was affected by the conflict, and not just Catholics, but Protestants, not just civilians, but also, I interviewed the son of an RUC reservist who was killed. I interviewed the son of one of 3 Protestant civilians who were killed in the Guildford pub bombing in 1975, New Year's Eve 1975, just before the O'Dowds were murdered. I interviewed 2 survivors of a bomb explosion in Newry, which targeted 3 people who worked for British Telecom, but who were also members of the Territorial Army. And so, my ambition is to, I think when I started out, somebody said, if I were you, I would just concentrate on your own community, the people that the kind of, your story, if you like. And I felt very strongly I didn't want to do that. I wanted to kind of tell the story in the round. Like the parish of Tullalish, or Lawrencetown, my village, and Guildford both lie on the River Bann, which is, has the Bann has been sort of used as a kind of a fault line, if you like, for describing the northwest of the Bann, more Catholic, more rural. East of the Bann, more predominantly Protestant, industrial. I grew up along the banks of the Bann, and there, Catholics and Protestants live side by side. Lawrencetown might have been predominantly Catholic, Guildford more 50-50, Tullalish predominantly Protestant, Lenaderg predominantly Protestant, but people lived and worked, even went to primary school and secondary school, alongside each other. And that created a kind of a different, we definitely didn't live in ghettos. We didn't live in segregated areas. And so there was definitely a different fabric to the community that I grew up in. Like Bobby Harrison, he was born, grew up, and was murdered in the village where he's from. And he had many Catholic friends, and I give the example, for example, of his wife's best friend, where he grew up in Tullalish, was Catholic. So she would go to early morning mass on a Sunday at 8:30 in Lawrencetown, and Mrs. Harrison would go to the Church of Ireland service at 11:30 in Tullalish. In between, they would meet at Mrs. McInerney's house, and they would have tea and buns and whatever, and catch up on the week's gossip. And Bobby, as well as being an RUC reservist, he had been in the B Specials, he had been in the Ulster Defence Regiment. These uniforms mean different things to different people, and they represent different things to different people. But he was also the longest serving nurse in Banville Hospital in Guildford for people with intellectual disabilities. And so he was a nurse by profession, and he actually whenever he visited, when Mr. McInerney was dying of cancer, Bobby Harrison was with him right at the end because he was a nurse as well. And that's just an example that, you can't pigeonhole people. You can't just sort of see the uniform they wear and define them by that. People wear different uniforms. And another thing about this book that I wanted to do, I didn't want just to sort of write the story of how people died. I wanted to write the story of who they were, how they lived, which is far more important. So Bobby, as well as all the uniforms that he wore, he also was a very talented singer. And, he played music in a Guildford band. In fact, after he was killed, there was the name of the band was changed to the Bobby Harrison Memorial Band, which again is important in how, people are remembered, which is a thread running through this book. But I also make the point that in the 1960s, he had a daughter. He and his wife had a daughter who, tragically died. She was, born with a condition, and after that, he wasn't able to sing in the church choir for a year. So again and again, I found this thread in the book of people who suffered violent death in their families during the Troubles, who had already suffered enormously. For example, the Kearnses, Eamon and Sheila Kearns that I interviewed, two of their sons were murdered on the day of their sister Roisin's 11th birthday, 30 years ago last weekend. But their first child was stillborn, Andrea. And so what I'm trying to say or communicate, I guess, is life is hard enough without imposing, the unnecessary burden of violent death, which the Troubles did on so many families in this island.
Yeah, I mean, I want to go back to the Central Bar bombing in Guildford.
Yeah.
And recently at an event that I attended, you were speaking about the book as well. And there was a young person who mentioned it was from Guildford and didn't know that bomb had went off or nothing had happened there. And I think that's why these books are important. We don't need to drag it all up and rehash it, but what we need to do is recognize that it did happen for the next generation to look at and learn from with fresh eyes that maybe aren't tainted like our own from the experiences that we've gained, but from eyes that are born after the 98 ceasefires and have had a different upbringing to what we had.
It's one of the sort of most, I don't know, symbolic or disturbing things for me. When you Google, so Guildford in my parish is Gilford. It lies between Banbridge, about halfway between Banbridge and Portadown. So 3 people lost their lives in a no-warning INLA bomb in that pub on New Year's Eve 1975. But if you Google Guildford pub bombing, it doesn't bring it up. It brings up the Guildford pub bombing in Surrey. And I kind of think, how symbolic is that of how those people's, the commonplace atrocities are such that one can, erase another. 3 people died for what? Not even to be remembered, not even to be kind of picked up by the Google algorithm, but rather to be erased by it. And I kind of think that says something about, all the suffering that we lived through that barely moved the dial in terms of, changing the constitutional status of the North or whatever way you want to describe it. All those lives had weight and meaning. And I think it's really important to remember them and sort of, I've written a book about the parish of Tullalish, but, I'd like to think that maybe it's, it could be an exemplar and people will write books about their own parishes or their own areas, because I don't think you can remember people's lives enough that were snuffed out in that way. I think I get the very strong sense talking to the people that I talk to in this book that, they've lost out on so much. They lost their loved ones, but also I think a lot of them feel that, they were left after a certain time to bear that weight alone. They like I say in the book, they did such heavy lifting for us all, in the sense that, they felt the weight of the coffin of a loved one on their shoulder, biting into their shoulder. And over time, sure, everybody turns up to the funeral. In the Catholic tradition, there's a month's mind where a lot of people will also turn up. The first anniversary, a few will be there, but over the years, that will dwindle, I think, to just the immediate family and maybe, really close friends. And I think what we all lived through, we suffered collectively, but really, some people suffered far more than others. Like there's families in this book, like the Feeneys, who suffered terribly, the O'Dowds. And I kind of think, they bear such an enormous weight. I think, the wider community owes them a debt, really. And I think we should bear some of that burden collectively by having some, national or, community-wide form of commemoration. Like, there's been talk recently, I guess, of, and if there were to be a reunited Ireland, would the 12th of July still to be would still be a national holiday, for example? How do we kind of respect both traditions on this island? Whatever about that, I would say, what we really need, and I think we need it now, and the families deserve it now, is a national day of mourning. I know we have Remembrance Day for the dead of the First and Second World War, and I have absolutely no issue with that. Like Eamon Kearns, who lost his two sons, his birthday is actually the 11th of the 11th. And he says, he watches those Remembrance Day services and he weeps for people who are bereaved or remembering their lost loved ones, be it parents or grandparents. But he says, I'm told I've got to move on. Church and state are saying, move on, leave your grief or whatever behind, but he won't forget. How can he forget the loss of his two loved ones, his sons? And I think, we as a community owe it to people like Eamon Kearns and everybody that features in Dirty Linen to remember just what they went through. And I think that can be healing. I think, you've had the legacy bill forced through, which achieved the rare achievement of uniting everybody in the North in opposition to it, because it protects maybe veterans in the British Army perhaps, but it abandons everyone else. And I think it was Jim Shannon, the DUP MP, that I saw almost breaking down in the House of Commons, expressing his unhappiness with that legislation. So it's something that affects not just Catholics or nationalists or Republicans, it affects Protestants, Unionists, Loyalists too.
I think, what you've touched on there is really important when you talk about, the victims and people who are left behind have a story to tell. And, time doesn't just stop when the newspaper article's written about a death or a murder. And that's something that's always struck me about this, Martin. Because, going back to the stuff I've written on recently around the anniversary of Bloody Friday, I was always struck by the story of Kay McGurdy, who spoke into the Way of Trauma Centre about her experience. Her husband, Jimmy, had been killed shortly after Bloody Friday with another man, Frank Core. They've been killed by the UDA. And, when you talk about compounding this unnecessary misery on people who've already suffered tragedy, it just brings me back to that story, because only a couple of months before Jimmy McGurdy was murdered, he and his wife had suffered a miscarriage. And, to alleviate that tragedy and to try and make life that bit easier, I think he'd been working in a bar and he decided then to take up ownership of a fancy goods shop. So he did this because he wanted to spend more time with his wife, who'd suffered this tragedy. And only 2 weeks after they acquired the shop, he was brutally abducted and murdered. And, she talks in her testimony about, the child who would have had a name. I can't remember the name offhand. Apologies for that. But that the child sort of cried out, that that the father had been killed. And it's just this sort of, to me, it's when you read that sort of account, you can see things in the newspaper. Even Lost Lives, I think, only goes so far because of the amount of space that's given over. But when you delve into these lives that have already suffered these tragedies, and that's why I think, a book like Dirty Linen is so important, because it gives room, I don't know if excavate's the right word, but it gives room to excavate these sort of experiences and sort of give them the sort of platform that they deserve. And when you talk about the legacy builder, it is important because anybody who, sort of drafts legislation like that should be reading books like this and realizing that these are the people who are actually impacted. And it's not just people who suddenly suffered this loss during the Troubles. It's people who've maybe suffered a tragedy in the immediate preceding weeks of a loved one's murder. And also, for myself, a lot of the murders that happened in the early 70s, a disproportionate amount of those people who were killed in Belfast were people who had been in psychiatric care. Very vulnerable human beings. So, I think we need to sort of understand more about the victims and their families than what we already have done. So, again, that's why I think Dirty Linen's so important.
Well, thanks for that. Talking about Bloody Friday there immediately makes me think of Jennifer McNairn, who's one of the people I interview in the book. So Jennifer and her sister Rosaline were in the Abercorn bombing, and Jennifer lost both her legs. Her sister Rosaline lost 2 legs, an arm and an eye. So Jennifer I interviewed because she's friends with Margaret Yeaman, who was blinded in a no-warning IRA bomb in Banbridge, my birthplace, 10 years later in 1982, in which an 11-year-old schoolboy, Alan McCrum, was killed. And the reason I interviewed both of them together, so Margaret's portrait was painted by Colin Davidson for his Silent Testimony series, which, I would sort of aspire to that Dirty Linen be sort of seen as a kind of a written version of what Colin has sought to do with Silent Testimony, which is portraits of victims, but also the families of victims, to sort of show, in their faces, they show in their faces the lines of grief. And then Jennifer McNairn. So the Abercorn bombing, in which she was maimed and her sister was maimed, it inspired, if that's the word, the Banbridge sculptor Effie McWilliam to do his series of sculptures called Women of Belfast, Women in a Bomb Blast. And so both of these people that I interviewed, who became friends through Wave, the victims charity, like Jennifer tells a funny story that she said to Margaret, this is how she introduced herself, "You're eating the decorations," because it was a Christmas dinner and the tinsel had fallen onto Margaret's plate, and obviously because she had lost her sight in the bombing, she didn't know what was happening. But, they have this wonderful, beautiful friendship, which is like, I don't want this book to be understood as misery lit. It isn't. There's a lot of light and hope in it as well, because the people that, there are profiles in Courage. I think that's actually the name of a biography of JFK. But actually, the people that I've interviewed are incredibly resilient. Obviously, they're incredibly hurt, and some of them are angry, some of them are stoic, but all of them, in their own ways, are heroic in the way that they have kind of got on with their lives despite the most awful tragedy. But sorry, back to the Abercorn bombing on Bloody Friday. Jennifer McNairn, maimed in an IRA no-warning bombing of the Abercorn, she thought to herself, at least, now this has happened. This will never happen. They'll never do that again, will they? The day that she got out of hospital was Bloody Friday. She was sent home in an ambulance on Bloody Friday. And you can imagine what that was like, navigating Belfast on a day when no-warning IRA bombs were going off left, right and centre. So that's one thing. I think that's a story that has a moral to it. And it's funny you talking about excavating, because I do think that so often the truth of the Troubles has been buried. Some people want it buried. Some people would pour concrete over it. You've got this incredible irony, to my mind, that, on the one hand, you've got the Legacy Bill. On the other hand, you've got the new interim chief constable of the PSNI, John Boucher. I pretty much shadowed him because a lot of the people I was interviewing were victims of the Glenanne gang, which he has spent the last 5 years investigating for a report that's due out next year. He told me that his ambition is to bring it out for the anniversary of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, which were also carried out by the Glenanne gang. But excavating, so one of the stories in my book, probably the story that inspired the book or gave me, the template, if you like, for writing it, was the story of the O'Dowds. So Barney O'Dowd was my milkman. Declan O'Dowd, his son, was our coal man. And so these were people that sort of stood on our step, every week, like Barney as a milkman every day. At the weekend, he would come to collect the week's money, and he wore a brown sort of shop coat and a satchel that he kind of wore around his body, and he'd allow you to kind of put your hand into his satchel and lift out a fistful of coins, which as a child was like untold riches. It was like a treasure chest. So this is somebody, who I knew intimately, and so what happened to his family, really disturbed me, I guess, as a child. And after two of his sons were murdered, he lost a kidney in the shooting. His brother Joe was also murdered. This happened in the family farmhouse, which is in a very remote part of the parish in Ballydugan, a few miles outside Lurgan. And the farmhouse is so remote, you wouldn't even know it was there. It's off a back road to begin with, but then it's down a kind of a laneway, which takes a turn or two before it comes to the house. So it's not even visible from the road. And in fact, the killers didn't come by road. They kind of crossed a couple of fields to get to that farmhouse, which obviously suggests, some degree of local knowledge. But, what happened with the O'Dowds after the murders, they moved south. Kathleen, the mother, was terrified that the killers would come back for the rest of her family, for her other sons. And then I never saw them again. And that was a sort of a gap or whatever in my childhood. After I wrote a piece about growing up in the north and mentioning what happened to the O'Dowds, Noel, one of the sons, got in touch and said, Barney was still alive. He was 98, but still sharp. Would I like to meet him? And so you can imagine how poignant that was, like meeting somebody after 40 odd years, a figure from your childhood. And, they told me their story, not just the story of what happened to those that were killed, but also Barney's story growing up. He went to the local Protestant primary school, had a lot of kind of local Protestant friends, starting the milk round. He got a tinsmith to make little churns that he would deliver the milk in and then collect them on the way back. So kind of fascinating social history. Barney's still alive. He just celebrated his 100th birthday this year. But that history, that social history, will die out with him. But the bit that really stuck in my mind was that when Kathleen died, the family decided, this was in just before the millennium in Christmas 1999, the family decided that they were going to exhume their brothers' bodies and rebury them beside their mother in County Meath. And the bit that really got me was that they did it themselves. And it's things that you find hard to imagine that stop you in your tracks and make you really kind of think, what that means. And to me, that was such an act of love. I couldn't imagine doing it myself, but I can, when you dwell on it, you kind of think, actually, I can see how that made sense to them as a family, and I can see why they wouldn't want strangers doing it. But still, like, to me, it's really spoke of the long tale of troubles trauma, which is, a line from the book. And it also reminded me, actually, the first death in Lost Lives, which is like kind of a Bible probably for all of us in terms of documenting everybody who was killed in the Troubles. The first person documented in Lost Lives, they had to exhume his body because he was killed by, I think, Gusty Spence and a couple of other loyalists. This is back in 1966. He was wandering home drunk, and the family insisted that he'd been shot, but that hadn't been confirmed. He was buried, but then they exhumed the body, and that only then did the coroner confirm that he had actually died by shooting rather than beaten up or whatever. So there is a sense in which the past, if you want to get to the truth, the truth has to be kind of excavated. And so there's this bizarre situation where, on the one hand, with the legacy bill, it's like the British government are pouring concrete over it, or shredding files, if you like, or sort of censoring files for decades to come. And yet, on the other hand, you've got John Boucher, the interim chief constable, who's been pursuing the truth with his magnifying glass for the last 5 years. And you kind of think, how can those two arms of the state, if you like, be working in harmony together. They seem to be at cross purposes. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, and you also mentioned in your book about HET, and there's some good comments in there about how underwhelming their investigations actually were on a lot of instances. I mean, I want to rewind a wee bit, and you're talking about the young lady getting out of hospital on Bloody Friday. I mean, you also talk about in the book the shared anniversaries, maybe years apart. You talk about Claudia and the people killed there, and then the Miami show ban is on exactly the same date. And the line you used, I think it was, we can't even have separate anniversaries for these atrocities. They overlap so much.
Yeah, that was the day that I interviewed Jennifer McNairn and Margaret Jamin in Jennifer's house in Belfast. So, these things sort of leap out at you. Like, the Miami was fresh in my mind because I'd interviewed Stephen Travers, one of the survivors of the Miami Showband massacre, because not just did it happen after they'd played a concert at the Castle Ballroom in Banbridge, but Stephen, after the atrocity, ended up moving to London and ended up co-founding two newspapers, the Irish World and the Irish and Britain News, as they became, which were the first two newspapers that I worked for as a journalist in London. So there's so many of these kind of odd connections that present themselves, but absolutely, your point is right.
Yeah, and we call it tit for tat here, and I think that's sometimes remiss of us because it makes it sound childish, calling it tit for tat. But you have incidents there where the O'Dowds are bringing their family's bodies home, and on the day that the people are gathering at the house, the Kings Mill massacre takes place. We look at this, and we have people, the likes of Robert Gibson we've had on the pod. We've got families there who are calling for no retaliation. But sometimes that falls on deaf ears, and the retaliation takes place despite the family saying they don't want it. So this place almost parts itself along on the trauma that we keep inflicting on each other.
It goes back to that idea, Sam. Sorry, Martin, but we talk about people having those tragedies in their lives and sort of the troubles, violence compounding that tragedy, but then in this instance, and when we talked to Robert Gibson about that and about how he felt about the killings that were perpetrated after his father had been murdered on Bloody Friday, it just re-traumatizes those people and makes them feel, talk about survivor's guilt, but it's that guilt, and it's a sort of endless cycle of misery and trauma.
Absolutely, but I think as well, we do need to kind of take a beat. And even though, so somebody appeals for no retaliation, and there is retaliation, but what we don't know is what else might have happened if they hadn't made that appeal, or even within the family circle. Like I make the point that religion gets a very bad rap in the Troubles, and rightly so, because there were people who wore collars around their necks on both sides who fomented violence and inspired violence. Ian Paisley has been sort of rehabilitated his reputation because he became a conciliatory figure, sharing power with Martin McGuinness late in life. But, let's make no bones about it. He was one of the progenitors of the conflict. He incited hatred against his Catholic neighbours throughout the early part of his career. Eamon Kearns, cites him coming to the Orange Hall in Bleary, near where he lived in Ballydugan, and spreading hatred among his Protestant neighbours for their Catholic neighbours. But on the other side, you have, the incredible faith of and Christian charity, or whatever way you want to call it, of families who became victims. So on the one hand, you had Philip McConville talking about his mother Rosie, who was paralysed after coming home from bingo, of all things, on a minibus to Bleary. And he was she lived in extreme pain for the rest of her life. Like Philip says, it would have been better for if she had died that night. Like, what a thing for a son to feel he had to say, having witnessed his mother suffering for so many years. But he would rub his mother's legs to try and give her some relief. And he would, this is him at 15, saying, Mum, if I ever find out who did this, I'll kill them. And she said, son, I pray for them every night. And that sort of stopped him in his tracks and made him think, she's a better woman than me. An aunt said that her mother said the rosary every night for the people who had not just left her daughter paralysed, but had also killed her father, who was on the minibus. And where am I going with this? And also, Alan McCrum, the young 11-year-old Protestant schoolboy who was killed in the no warning IRA bomb in 1982 in Banbridge. His uncle Dixon, another God-fearing man, said that he accepted what happened to Alan as God's will. Both of them appealed for no retaliation. And like I said, there might have been retaliation, but who knows what greater violence might have happened. Was it not for that kind of backstop that kind of stopped the North really tipping over into the abyss? Like, we know what happened in the North, but we also know what happened in the former Yugoslavia and how far worse the breakdown of society there was. So, the troubles were terrible, but there came a point again and again where it looked as if it was going to spiral out of control, as in, the recent anniversary of the Shankill Road bombing atrocity. It looked then, and then you had Greysdale, and the Kearnses were killed around that time, and several other people, and it looked as if, society was going to break down. But it didn't happen, and I kind of think, it's hard to be, specific or exact about it, but I do believe that, the goodness is all you can call it, I guess, of the majority on both sides was like a backstop that stopped the North sliding into barbarism.
One of the most astonishing episodes in the book for me, and it's something I had never known, was about the friendship between the Feeneys, John Michael Feeney and Brian Faulkner. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. And when you talk about the desire for revenge, the one that stood out for me was when Faulkner came to the house after John Michael had been murdered, and he said to Declan, the son, "Your father was killed by evil men, and if I could get my hands on them, I'd tear them from limb to limb." And that just jumped. I mean, that was astonishing. Another side of Faulkner that I would never have even countenanced. And then the fact that Declan then goes on to become friendly with Prince Charles, who sends sympathy to his mother. And I mean, it's just... There's talking about the complexity of the North. That's just a different level, even for me, to try and comprehend.
Like sport has always, created strange bedfellows or whatever, and hunting maybe in particular. I don't know if you're familiar with the Irish RM, Somerville and Ross. It was adapted for screen maybe back in the 80s, was it, with Peter Bowles as the lead character. So this is like kind of, you've got the aristocracy hunting, shooting, fishing, but you've also got the kind of the local working class, if you like, who are the ones who sort of, look after the horses or the hounds, whatever. So John Michael Feeney, he had just got his dream job as number 2 in the Ivy Harriers to, of all people, Brian Faulkner. So John Michael and the family had just moved into the stables in St. Patrick, looking after the hounds. And they were a really sporting family. So John Michael's son, Jimmy, had just won the senior boxing title, like the All-Ireland title at his weight, in the National Stadium in Dublin. That was on the Friday night. On the Sunday evening, John Michael brings Jimmy to show him off to some friends in Leary Darts Club, a few miles away. And at some stage in the evening, Jimmy went out to go to the toilet. Like, we're talking about, this place was an old weaver's cottage. It was like a shebeen, really. Like, so it had a darts club. It had a few tables for people playing cards or people just meeting for a drink. And Jimmy goes outside to the toilet, and while he's outside, loyalist gunmen turn up, kick open the door, and start spraying the room. And Jimmy comes back just as this is happening, and he can see there's no light, that somebody's knocked off the lights inside. So the only available light was the muzzle flash from the gunman's weapon. And so that was, by that light, he was able to describe to the RUC the colour of the trousers and the shoes that the gunman was wearing. And I say in the book, what light could be darker? What light could be darker than that emanating from the weapon that's killing your father? And that was the light that he saw by for the rest of his days. And I say that because Jimmy became an alcoholic. He was sucked into joining the official IRA, caught during an armed robbery with a getaway van that was actually, he had taken over from his dad at, as number 2 to Faulkner. So he drove around the country picking up fallen stock. In other words, dead animals to feed to the hounds. And they actually used the carcasses of these dead cows, whatever, to hide the money bags from an armed robbery of a Securicorps van. But then later Jimmy became an alcoholic and he ended up taking his own life. He died by suicide. So, that again to me is the long tail of trauma. Jimmy was on course to go to box in the Montreal Olympics. Instead, he ended up in Longkesh and ended up ultimately taking his own life. Now that's tragedy. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is sort of, maybe tell the story in a little different way. Like, that words like Declan, his John Michael's one of his other sons, Jimmy's brother, as you say, he ended up going over to England and hunting with Prince Charles and being invited to Highgrove, and there's photographs in his home of him and his wife with Charles and Camilla, again, strange bedfellows. But, Declan was talking to me and he described, his job and going around collecting fallen stock. And that word, like, I'm from the country, but, these hands are, they've held a pen rather than a spade. And I wasn't familiar with the term, and I kind of thought about it, and it made me think that, the North, was like one charnel house, that we were all, like all the victims of the Troubles, are like fallen stock, that we were treated in the same way that you can think what you like about blood sports. A lot of people, think it's wrong to kill animals for entertainment or whatever. I know there's other arguments about keeping, foxes and whatever down. But I thought about that fallen stock, and it reminded me, this idea that, the humans in the North were being hunted down and killed. And it reminded me of another incident that happened 30 years ago next month, where 2 Catholics in Belfast, like a 15-year-old and a 31-year-old taxi driver, were shot dead by using shotguns, using big balls of shot that would be used for big game hunting. And you can just imagine that kind of overkill, that kind of sadism. You can imagine the kind of wounds that inflicted on those people. And it kind of made me think again, that just to reinforce this idea of, humans being hunted down, or humans hunting down other humans and treating them like, as if they were big game hunting. And then that reminded me of a line from Shakespeare. It's Gloucester in King Lear, and he says, what are we but flies to, hold on, got it here. Sorry, I'll pull it up. So, yeah, I'll just read it. So on the 5th of December 1993, the UDA murdered 15-year-old Brian Duffy and John Todd, a 31-year-old taxi driver, Belfast Catholics. They used a shotgun firing ammunition normally used for big game hunting. The coroner said that large balls of shot exacted terrible injuries to both victims. In the words of Gloucester from King Lear, as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. So, my book is unashamedly victim-centered. I'm not really fascinated by what motivates murderers, what motivates killers. Some of them are motivated by an ideology that, Republican ideology perhaps. Some of them are motivated by bigotry and sectarian hatred. There's books, there's a couple of books this year out actually about a notorious Southern murder, the murder in the Phoenix Park by this guy, this sort of wealthy, sort of Anglo-Irish guy, Malcolm MacArthur. It became known as the Gubu murders because he ended up being caught in the apartment of the Southern Attorney General. And Charles Haughey famously said this was grotesque, unbelievable, bizarre, and unprecedented. And Conor Cruise O'Brien christened Haughey Gubu after that. So 2 people, a colleague of mine, Harry McGee, and Mark O'Connell, very well-regarded writer, have written books about that. And that's fine. But, what interests me is the suffering of the victims and their families, and how their families cope and deal with that afterwards. I think that's the more interesting story. That's where the humanity is. That's where, the good stuff is, in my opinion. And I just wanted to sort of shine a light on their stories.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there, Sam. Martin, I totally agree, and I think it is, as time progresses and we do have things like the legacy legislation, it is the more textured and more interesting story, and it's the one that needs to be heard. I mean, coming from the background that I come from, and you know this because you've commissioned me to write stuff for the Irish Times, I've written on the motivations of young men joining the loyalist paramilitaries, the tartan gangs. Then I did the book with Billy Hutchinson, which, I think, people didn't realise my background until it came out, and you commissioned me to write that article, which I was really happy to do. And I mean, to be honest, that book coming out with Billy sort of dovetailed with me moving back to North Belfast after years living away from North Belfast. We bought a house back here. Me and my partner and my child live here now, and it did cause me to re-examine some of the motivations for why I became interested in the Troubles history. And basically, it came back to trying to understand victims and the experiences of victims and people who were killed in North Belfast. And one of the murders in your book that really sort of struck a nerve with me, because I was familiar with it, having worked in the Public Record Office, was Pat Campbell's murder by Robin Jackson. Now, I had processed that file. So I'd read some of that material before about, the scene in the hallway. The thing that always stuck with me was Margaret, his wife, having to then go to the police station and identify by putting the hand on the shoulder. Which again, looking back, thinking you're having to identify the man who killed your husband. It's not even behind glass. It's you're having to actually touch this guy on the shoulder.
Yep.
I mean, then all the outworkings of that and the sort of questions over Robin Jackson's role and, his role in the security forces and this, that and the other. And, and me and Sam have had this conversation, and I know it's an evolving process in my head and from the background I come from and from North Belfast. And walking these streets in North Belfast, I do begin to, revisit that idea of being a second-class citizen. Now, I have a sort of paradoxical experience because I was privileged. I came from a middle-class background. One of the stories in your book reminded me of how that came to be when your mum said about, not wanting you to work in the shoe factory. And, my granny had a similar experience. She told my uncle, she saw a guy digging the road one day and she said to my uncle, "I don't want that for you. This is why education's so important." And my granny was a Protestant, converted to Catholicism. So there's all that sort of, sort of complexity going on in the background. So I never felt like a second-class citizen until I went to Methody. And I've talked about this before. And, there's stuff in your book that really reminded me of this and the sort of conversations I have with myself. When you were working in London, and you came back and, one of your friends from the academy said you were working for a Provo newspaper. It just brought me right back to Methody in the sort of late 90s, where bizarre now, comical almost when you look back, that idea of Irishness or Catholicism being associated with provisional republicanism. I mean, I remember having a copy of The Queen is Dead by the Smiths, and giving it back to a friend of mine who'd lent it to me. The friend was actually from the Shankill. And another friend whose brother was in the RUC and very middle-class Protestant saw me handing this record back to the other friend, and he said, "That's just typical of you, Mulvanna. The Queen is Dead." And the other one, which is even more farcical, was, I think it was maybe we had a U2 CD or something. I don't know. It was one of U2's albums. And another friend of mine said, "Typical Mulvanna. They give all their money to the IRA." And it's only now looking back in that and reassessing it through the lens of your work and the sort of experiences I've had interrogating the past through a victim's perspective, I begin to wonder, actually, no matter what our social status was in class terms, we probably always were second-class citizens, ultimately.
There's some, obviously I've got a whole chapter in the book about, going, I'm from a working class background, went to Banbridge Academy after passing the 11 plus, whatever. And as I say in the book, it wasn't a mixed school or an integrated school. It was diluted orange. In other words, I think it was about 10% of us were Catholic, and we were admitted, but we weren't accommodated. In other words, they let us in, but they basically changed nothing to kind of, acknowledge the fact that we were from a different background, a different tradition.
Same as Methody.
Pardon?
Same as Methody.
Very possibly so. And it's funny, there's lots of the book about sort of IRA murders, lots about loyalist murders, whatever. And I'd probably, I'd like to think, they'd probably think, yeah, that's what happened. Yeah, we did that and whatever. And you know what, if the circumstances are right, we do it again. The stuff that kind of seems to maybe get under people's skin is when you're talking about the sectarianism, the petty stuff. So, to me, there is a kind of a spectrum that starts with sectarian slurs and ends with assassination. But, it's, I think people from a middle-class background that probably thought, oh, that Banbridge is a lovely, nice middle-class town, or Banbridge Academy is a nice, respectable school, and none of that bad stuff happened there. Well, actually, it did happen. And, there's a story in the Belfast Telegraph recently, they made a news story out of an episode in the book, which is Paula Jordan, who is a girl from Lawrencetown, from my village, who's a couple of years ahead of me. She's a pillar of the community. She's been a special needs school principal in Tyrone for the past 20 years. She was appointed MBE. She was actually invited to attend the Queen's funeral. This is how much a pillar of the community she is. And yet her career as a teacher was almost sabotaged at birth by the sectarian action of her headmaster at Banbridge Academy. So this is going back to the 80s, but he gave her such a bad reference. He lied and basically said she played truant, she was disruptive in class, so that she wouldn't get a place on a course. And she didn't get a place, even though people with lesser grades did. And the irony of it is that he'd actually written a personal letter to her thanking her for giving up her free time to teach or to sort of volunteer at the special needs school in Banbridge, which his own child attended. I can't get my head around that. But, this is the stuff that went on. And, I think we need to sort of, you might say, oh, why bring up that stuff? But actually, if nobody ever knew it happened and nobody did know outside maybe the close family circle, well then, history is always, history and revisionism, they go hand in hand. History is always being revised as new information comes out. And I kind of think it's important to shine a light in some of these sort of darker corners. And of course, don't get me wrong, discrimination is bad. Indiscriminate murder is so much worse. And that's why the chapter about the discrimination I experienced at the Banbridge Academy is followed by the chapter about the murder of Alan McCrum. He was an 11-year-old schoolboy, 2 years younger than me. He didn't get a chance to kind of, put his school years behind him and make a career for himself. He was murdered by the IRA. And I think that's obviously a far greater crime and atrocity.
Yeah, I think I'll close out with just a couple of comments on what Gareth said there as well. I also found that grammar school didn't make accommodation for those of working class children as well. You got a school uniform grant that barely covered the cost of the blazer, never mind anything else, and they made no allowances on it. Yeah. Also, the class thing that we were discussing there about second-class citizens, I know Gareth was spoken this a whole lot, but one of the quotes that sort of strikes me all the time when we talk about this is the one by Hugh Smith, the former Lord Mayor and PUP leader. And it goes, historically, unionist politicians fed their electorate the myth that they were first-class citizens, and without question, people believed them. Historically, Republican nationalist politicians fed their electorate the myth that they were second-class citizens, and without question, people believed them. In reality, the truth of the matter was that we were all Protestant and Catholic, were third-class citizens, and none of us realised it. And I think that sort of feeds into we were hunted for sport. This was an open safari ground for a lot of people. Yeah. And people were used and people were encouraged to do things on each other. Yeah, the killing fields.
there's a line in, or there's a couple of things that sort of strike me having written it, and then, like, it's not as if I'm reading it back loving myself. You read it back because you've got to cut 30,000 words, or you've got to proofread it, blah, blah, blah. And so in that process, some things start to emerge that you didn't even notice first time around. And one of the things that emerged for me was just like it's a variation of what you're saying there, Sam. And I remember, and I write about my mum cleaning, cleaning the front step in our house in Miller Park in Lawrencetown. It was a council house, and it was cement, but she cleaned it with Vim or whatever else on a scrubbing brush as if it was marble, just to kind of make it sort of, that bluey white thing or whatever that would last a couple of days. And Richard Beattie from Guildford, he spoke about his mother doing the same. And this idea of, I think Richard says something like, what did those little houses have? They had nothing, these little mill cottages. And I think he describes, the step was red. It was some kind of whatever, and there's some kind of, cleaning product you could get to sort of, to keep it sort of looking spick and span. But like, he makes the point that, we all lived in these kind of, very modest houses or whatever. So there was no privilege on either side there for sure. And then that idea of the front step, and then how those front doorsteps that, the mothers scrubbed and cleaned, and how they were sullied by, gunmen, like, coming to the front door of the back door of the O'Dowds or the front door of Pat Campbell and shooting him dead. A shop steward, a man who sort of, who basically run like a citizens advice bureau from his own home in the evening, and during the working day was a shop steward in down shoes. This is a man looking out for everybody and representing the working class, and yet he was the victim of a sectarian assassination. What was the other point there I was going to make? The other thing that sort of came to me in writing this book was the motif of the handkerchief. So the first job my mother had was working in Blaine's factory, a handkerchief factory in Bleary. And I just thought, like, how symbolic, like, making handkerchiefs which you associate with blood, with sweat, with tears. And I kind of thought, Rosie McConville, she stitched the hems of, it was piecework. The hankies were sort of sent out to homes in the parish, and Rosie, stitched dozens, hundreds of handkerchiefs every week while the kids were at school or after they went to bed. And sometimes her younger sisters would help her. And I say it was sweated labour. It was pocket money. It was pocket handkerchief money. It wasn't enough to live on. It was something that a woman could do because the man was earning whatever money, and then whatever they earned was just kind of, a little bit of cream on top. You couldn't live off the labour, the money that was paid for that labour. And then you kind of think, obviously, of, Bishop Edward Daly and his handkerchief on Bloody Sunday, but also the Kearns brothers when they were being buried. The priest, I interviewed him years later, and he remembered a handkerchief falling out of his sleeve onto one of the coffins, which kind of woke him from a trance, and he kind of realised the enormity of what he was doing, like burying not just one son but two, and the massive yawning grave to accommodate two coffins. And then I come across on social media somebody posting from the Guards Museum in London, just down from Buckingham Palace, and it's a tribute, a memorial to Robert Narak, and it's a handkerchief that he was found in his possessions after his disappearance when he was, kidnapped and murdered by the IRA. But the linen handkerchief that he had was a UVF handkerchief, which had been sort of, stitched and embroidered, probably in Long Kesh, by, UVF members with UVF symbols and drawings. And you kind of think, what was he doing with that handkerchief? It wasn't a trophy from somebody that he had arrested. The suspicion is that it was something that was given to him as a kind of a thank you or whatever by people that he was consorting with. So, that's a sobering thing.
Well, Martin, thank you very much for taking the time today. It's a magnificent achievement, the book, and, you've given voice to a lot of people who otherwise might not have had a voice. So, it's testament to your empathy and skills as a writer that you've projected those stories and given them the space that they deserve.
Thanks very much, Gareth. Appreciate that.
Yeah, as I said, Martin, I did enjoy the book, as uncomfortable as it was in bits. It certainly evoked some memories, but thoughts about how we go forward, how we learn from the past and move away from it, but yet remember those that we're leaving behind and give them the place and the space that they require. So, Martin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate that too.
Goodbye now.
Cheers.